But just because it's a little easier, I'm going to start with the reading that we didn't read today. And just like last week, I'm going to sort of assign that as homework. So you go to lectionary.anglican.ca. It will take you to a page where you can see the lectionary readings, not just for this week, but you can find them there actually daily. Find the page and look up the references. Just after I've closed this, my memory is challenging me today. It is Genesis chapter 45, 1 to 15. It's the story of Joseph after he has risen to power in the Egyptian court, and he is confronting his brothers and revealing his true identity. There's this moment of revelation. There's this moment of coming back together with Joseph and his brothers. And he's saying that they shouldn't feel bad about having sold him into slavery, because out of that, God has done a very good thing. And so in that story, Joseph, because of his position, something that we could equate to being a prime minister in today's world, he has been able to ensure that there's enough grain stored up. And so the drought that has stricken the land, there's enough grain for all the people, including Joseph's own household, which isn't literally like a household of people. It's his father's clan. It is Jacob's family. So, out of this tragedy of Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery, there is this good end. Now, in Paul's letter today, he is saying that God has not abandoned his chosen people. He means the Jews, he means the people Israel, but he is continually trying to bring them back in, make sure that they are redeemed and restored. And so here's Paul, a convert to Christianity, and he is saying this to other new Christians, people in the early life of the church, that God has not abandoned them. There's some interesting lines and challenging lines in there. He's saying that God has imprisoned everyone in disobedience so that God can show mercy. It's an interesting thought to think that God has imprisoned all people throughout time in a way of living and being that is in disobedience to God, simply so that God can show mercy. I'm going to leave that for a second, and then the gospel reading that we have today. So, at first, Jesus offers this teaching. It says that it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles you, but in fact, it's what comes out. Now, this is in direct contradiction of laws that the Jews had about what to eat and how to eat food, and saying that some things, if you ate them, would make you unclean and therefore unacceptable to God. You would have to go and ritually purify yourself to cleanse yourself from that uncleanness. And so here's Jesus challenging those laws which had been in existence for hundreds and hundreds, if not a couple thousand years at that point, a way of living and being. And here's Jesus essentially saying, yeah, those dietary laws, that's not what causes you to be impure or unclean, but it's what comes out of your mouth. And so he means words. He's meaning basically a moral judgment. And he's making that judgment on the people who were the quote-unquote keepers of the law, the ones who tried to make sure that everybody else was following those laws. And as part of Jesus' challenge to them is sort of saying, you do this and say that you're keeping yourselves and everybody else ritually pure and clean, and yet by your actions and your words, you show that you are actually unclean. You show that you are impure. And so whether that's cruelty or meanness, unkindness, all manner of things which hurt people. There is this notion that what comes out of the mouth comes directly from the heart. And so if what comes out of the mouth is malice and vitriol and anger, then that is what is in the heart. And so Jesus is challenging the people who hear this to really think and ponder about what is in their heart and therefore what comes out. After Jesus offers this teaching and explains it a little bit to his disciples, then, as it says, they left that place and they went to Tyre and Sidon. Now, way back in Genesis, when the Israelites first came to what became Israel, it says that they entered into the land of Canaan. Now, archaeologists and historians looking at all of the information suspect that actually that movement of people that we look at in the Exodus story, but that movement of people, sorry, I said Genesis a moment ago, I did mean Exodus. The movement of people was so slow, in fact, that the people who we look at having become the Israelites, a lot of them had lived in the land long enough that they were considered to be Canaanites. So in the land of Canaan, there was actually a mix of people who were Israelites, who were Jews, and people who weren't. But that particular area, Tyre and Sidon, was a traditional Canaanite land. And so it says that they went there, and then this woman, and they identify her as a Canaanite woman simply because she's in that land. But we don't know if she comes from a Semitic background or if she's from a non-Semitic background. And I guess in some ways it doesn't matter to the story, but we're sort of left with this impression, and often preachers and others just fall into it. We say, oh, she was a Canaanite woman, so she was a Gentile, she didn't believe in the same God. There's actually nothing here that says that. But this Canaanite woman, a woman from that place, came and asks Jesus for help. And curiously, Jesus appears, at least from what we read in the text, Jesus appears to just ignore her. And then the disciples say to Jesus, get rid of her. She's annoying us. She's just shouting at us. And then Jesus engages. I mean, part of that, wondering about the origin of the woman, until you read a little bit further, you wonder, is she speaking the same language? Like, does Jesus understand what she's saying? Like, is there a reason why he's not responding? Trying to look for that rational reason as to why Jesus would just ignore this woman. Because if you go back in the preceding chapters, Jesus is teaching and healing and preaching and challenging his opponents all over the place. He's talking to people, Jews, and Gentiles, and all different kinds of people, rich and poor, all these people. And then all of a sudden this woman is asking him for help, and he's ignoring her. And then comes this very challenging interaction. So in this interaction, again, preachers will often look at this and say, well, Jesus was testing the Canaanite woman's faith. And so because she persists, then she is rewarded, and Jesus says, your daughter is healed. And yet, in the rest of the gospel, that healing and that insight and that knowledge doesn't ever seem to be offered as a reward. So it leaves me again with questions about what is going on here. And I'll give you the sneak peek to the end of the sermon. I don't have a good and clear answer for you. I have a lot of questions that I'm going to leave you with. So Jesus, just before this, has been teaching about what goes into the mouth and what comes out of the mouth, and what causes one to become impure. And so what Jesus says to this woman, that it's not fair to give the children's food to the dogs. It's not fair to give the children's food to the dogs. I have come for the lost ones of Israel. And this woman responds by saying, Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. I mean, on the surface, it sounds strange, but it's just kind of a quick exchange. But the more you sit with it and the more you look at the words, the stranger it gets and the less clear it becomes. So this idea that Jesus is testing the woman, just that idea of testing. Again, if you go in the preceding chapters in the Gospel of Matthew, you go back chapter 14, chapter 13, chapter 12, chapter 11. As Jesus is traveling around, he's teaching people, but he's also testing people. He's testing his own disciples. He's testing the opponents, whether they're Pharisees or others. He's testing people in a lot of different ways all the time. Sometimes it's with the parables. And so we had that example just before. Jesus offending a bunch of the Pharisees because he's challenging the purity laws, the laws about food and what causes one to be impure. So he's testing them. And then he's testing his own disciples. He's like, what? You still don't get it? Come on, listen. So Jesus is pushing all the time. He's always pushing people to open up their eyes, to open up their ears, and open up their hearts, and to really pay attention. And in fact, he says at one point that seeing they do not perceive, hearing they do not listen. Those words in and of themselves are challenging. Imagine the reaction of the 12 who were following Jesus around on this journey, teaching and preaching and healing. And so he's challenging them. Are you really seeing? Are you really hearing? And so for us reading the text today, that question looms large. Are we seeing? Are we actually perceiving what Jesus means? Are we hearing, and are we actually listening? So Jesus' words are challenging, and particularly so here. So Jesus offers this comment to this woman, and it's just as baffling in some ways as the parables, and especially because Jesus doesn't offer an explanation. In the preceding verse before they meet this Canaanite woman in Tyre and Sidon, he offers an explanation about what goes into the mouth versus what comes out. He explains to the disciples in private, but he explains in the text. But here there is no explanation. The woman's asking for help. Jesus says nothing. The disciples say, get rid of her. Jesus says this very strange thing. The woman responds with something. And just by her response alone, I would argue that she is both perceiving and listening, which goes back to the earlier point a little bit about, she's probably not a pagan or a Gentile. For her to engage with Jesus in that way, and remembering kind of the flavor of culture at the day, in some ways, it would have been very difficult just for her to come alone without a man and to be speaking to Jesus, asking for help. Although it does seem to happen to Jesus a fair bit. So not only is Jesus pushing those boundaries, but the people coming to ask Jesus for help are also pushing those boundaries. So I would argue that this woman does perceive and that she is listening. And so is that it? Is there this test? And is it okay? And I think that perhaps, just for me, comes down to part of my discomfort with the idea of Jesus testing this woman. Because it's parents and in school and in life, there are tests. Whether it's sports or academics or just sort of life lessons, there are those instances where we are tested. And it's a good thing to show that we are able to put into practice what we have learned. But the idea of God testing people in crisis is hard. It's very hard. And so this woman comes to Jesus with something very serious, and perhaps in our modern scientific age it doesn't seem as serious, but this woman comes and says, my daughter is being tormented by a demon. This is big, right? In that time with the disciples, when Jesus was walking around with them, this is a big deal. And especially, again, in the preceding chapters, there's instances of Jesus casting out demons, Jesus healing people of these kinds of afflictions. So this woman comes with this big, important ask. My daughter is afflicted by demons. So this idea that God would test this woman in crisis, in distress. And that's sort of the rub. Because it makes it hard to talk about a God who loves us and a God who redeems and restores and sustains when in the midst of crisis we say, oh, but God will test you just to see if your faith is strong enough. Well, is faith a test? In Philosophy 101, I did literally take Philosophy 101 in university, we learned about Pascal's wager. So Pascal, a French philosopher, this idea of the wager being that, you can bet that God doesn't exist, and if God doesn't exist, then, when you die, and life is what it is, and, you haven't lost anything. Or you could bet that God does exist, and then if you find out that, there is life after death, and God is God, and you believed in God, and so then there's this, then, you reap all of those benefits. And then if you wager that God does exist, and then you find out that God doesn't, well, you haven't really lost anything. Interesting philosophical exercise. But is faith, is our life, an interesting philosophical exercise? It's sort of like the Cartesian, Descartes, asking, what is real? The modern extrapolation is the idea of, is this all real? Is your home, living room, office, inside, outside your house, wherever you are right now, is that real, or are you just a brain in a vat? We would wager that faith, as it relates to life, is not just a test, that faith is life. And our life in faith, that journey, is one that helps us ride the waves, the crests, the troughs, the ups and the downs, and that as we journey in faith in life, ultimately the end of that journey is God's own heart, that we return to our Creator. And so in the midst of crisis, is God testing us? In the midst of people dealing with diseases, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's cancer, whether it's degenerative diseases, ALS, MS, you pick the disease. And is that a test? There was a movie a number of years ago that came out. It's called The Game. And Michael Douglas plays this businessman who is abducted and drugged, and he wakes up in a bus station, I think, in Mexico. And the movie is spent, there's these people chasing him, and he's trying to figure out what happened, and he's in touch with family back home, and they seem to be trying to help him, and just nothing works. And it's this very tense, gritty movie as he tries to get back from Mexico into the States. He has no identification, he has no money, he has nothing, and these mysterious people are pursuing him. And then at the end of the movie, it turns out it was all a game. It turns out it was entirely orchestrated, and it was a birthday present given to him. Very interesting. So, at the end, after all that, his heart calms down probably a few weeks or months later, but, he calms down. He's like, oh, it's all a game. Like, oh, man. I bring up this movie and the example because that's not what this is. With this woman coming to Jesus, it's not some elaborate setup for this woman. Oh, it's all just a test of your faith. No, her daughter is afflicted. And she's probably been to local faith healers and people to try and help, and nothing has worked. And she's probably heard that Jesus has come to Tyre and Sidon, and she's gone looking for him. And she knows what that means socially. She knows that it will be a challenge to her as a woman going to find Jesus herself. And you see it in the reaction of the disciples. Send her away. Get rid of her. She's just annoying us. And again, Jesus' curious reaction. So to flip that whole thing on its head, maybe the test isn't about this woman and her daughter and the healing that Jesus does ultimately give, but maybe the test is to us as readers and hearers of the word now. So that test, are we seeing and perceiving? Are we hearing and listening? Is the test for us, have we become like the Pharisees? Are we more interested in what goes in the mouth than what comes out of the mouth? And I will tell you, as an ordained leader in the Anglican Church, I fear, in a sense, that test. That inadvertently becoming like one of Jesus' opponents. Inadvertently becoming hard-hearted, seeing but not perceiving, hearing but not listening. Cold and uncaring in a world that needs God's love, in a world that needs Jesus more than ever, especially in the midst of the pandemic. And so as the pandemic has held up a mirror for us so that we can see our actions, so that we can hear our words, is this test for us? Are we found wanting? And again, that's my fear as a leader. Am I found wanting? Am I good enough to be in this position, offering words, quote unquote, of wisdom to people, reading words like this in Scripture and being challenged by them? Maybe. It's not clear. And there is a danger of reading too much into a short story like this. But I think it is good to hold on to these questions and to wrestle with them. And to perhaps, as a paradox, become comfortable with being uncomfortable. To be a little bit more comfortable with the fact that answers aren't straight and easy and clear and easily accessible. That it actually takes work to perceive. That it actually takes work to listen and put into practice. Faith is not just a test. Did you score an A or a B or a D or an F? Faith is a journey, and one that we journey on together. So we don't offer any clear and simple and easy answers. But I do urge you to look at this story again, to read Paul's words and reflections. Is it all that we are trapped into being imperfect so that God's abundant mercy can be shown to us? Is it like Joseph and his brothers? Don't worry. Don't worry about having sold me into slavery, because God was able to do something amazing and miraculous out of it. Sit with the discomfort of all of those points and ponder and pray. And look at the words of Jesus and perceive. And listen to Jesus' words and hear. So that we, as the body of Christ that we claim to be, work together to live these words out and to put them into practice. To be the hands and feet that offer the care that is needed to people in crisis and comfort and reassurance to everyone. Sit with those hard questions and let them urge you on in your journey of faith. Amen.